Welcome, weary travelers, to a gentle journey through the questionable choices of South Park's most chaotic father figure. Tonight, we explore the complicated legacy of Randy Marsh, a man whose well-intentioned dreams consistently spiral into devastating consequences for everyone around him. From his earliest background appearances to his transformation into Colorado's most notorious weed entrepreneur, Randy represents the eternal struggle between ambition and wisdom, between wanting to matter and understanding one's place in the world. So settle into your covers. Close your eyes like you're drifting off during one of Randy's geological lectures, and let us drift together through the surprisingly complex moral landscape of South Park's most problematic patriarch. Rest easy, and let's begin. In the complex evolutionary biology of animated character development, few transformations reveal as much about the intersection of creative vision and unintended consequences as the metamorphosis of Randall Marsh from forgettable background figure into South Park's most chaotic catalyst. His journey from bland suburban father to manic agent of destruction represents one of television's most organic yet troubling character evolutions, demonstrating how creative decisions made in service of comedy can inadvertently create psychological portraits of profound dysfunction that resonate far beyond their intended scope. The man who began as nothing more than Stan's monotone dad would eventually become the embodiment of middle-aged American masculinity at its most destructive, a cautionary tale about what happens when privilege meets insecurity and enthusiasm overwhelms wisdom. The earliest incarnations of Randy Marsh reveal a character designed primarily to fulfill the basic narrative function of providing parental authority and adult perspective within South Park's child-centric universe. His initial appearances showcase the archetypal suburban father figure, complete with the emotional flatness and practical concerns that creators Matt Stone and Trey Parker associated with their own fathers during their Colorado childhoods. The deliberate blandness of his early characterization served important structural purposes within the show's ecosystem, providing a stable adult presence against which the children's anarchic energy could create comedic contrast without overwhelming the fundamental dynamics that made South Park compelling. The vocal patterns that defined early Randy reflect Trey Parker's conscious decision to base the character on his own father's speech patterns, creating a form of audio autobiography that grounded the fictional character in authentic emotional memory. The monotone delivery and matter-of-fact responses to increasingly absurd situations established Randy as the kind of adult who had long since surrendered any expectation of excitement or surprise from daily life, accepting whatever chaos erupted around him with the resigned tolerance of someone who had learned that resistance was futile and emotional investment was dangerous. This foundational characterization reveals the sophisticated understanding of adult psychology that would eventually fuel Randy's more extreme behaviors, establishing him as someone whose surface calm masked deeper currents of dissatisfaction and unfulfilled longing that would later explode into increasingly desperate attempts at significance and recognition. The seeds of his future chaos were planted in these early moments of apparent stability, creating a psychological foundation that would support increasingly elaborate structures of self-deception and destructive behavior. The geological profession that defined Randy's early adult identity serves as perfect metaphor for his relationship with truth and stability, positioning him as someone whose job literally involved digging beneath surface appearances to understand the hidden forces that shape the world. His scientific training should have equipped him with analytical thinking and evidence-based decision-making, yet his later behavior demonstrates how education and expertise can be corrupted when filtered through the distorting lens of personal insecurity and desperate need for validation from others. The irony embedded in Randy's professional identity becomes increasingly apparent as his character develops, revealing someone who understands the theoretical principles of cause and effect in geological systems, while remaining completely blind to the emotional and social consequences of his own actions. His ability to analyze rock formations and tectonic movements contrasts sharply with his inability to predict how his schemes will affect his family and community, suggesting that intellectual capability means nothing without emotional intelligence and genuine consideration for others' welfare. The transformation from geological consultant to chaos agent represents more than simple character development. It embodies a broader cultural anxiety about the reliability of expertise and the ways that specialized knowledge can become weaponized when divorced from wisdom and ethical consideration. Randy's scientific background lends credibility to his later pronouncements about global warming and environmental disasters, even when his conclusions are based on speculation rather than rigorous analysis, demonstrating how professional credentials can be manipulated to serve personal rather than public interests. The baseball fight episode that marked Randy's true emergence as a major character represents a crucial turning point where his suppressed frustrations finally found socially acceptable expression through the culturally sanctioned arena of competitive sports. The seemingly innocent context of children's Little League baseball provided the perfect cover for Randy to unleash years of accumulated resentment and disappointment without having to acknowledge the deeper psychological issues driving his behavior, allowing him to frame his violence and aggression as passionate parental support rather than personal emotional dysfunction. The psychological mechanics underlying his baseball confrontations reveal the sophisticated character work taking place beneath the surface comedy, showing how seemingly minor triggers can unleash disproportionate responses when they connect with deeper patterns of inadequacy and frustrated ambition. His willingness to engage in physical violence over children's sports scores demonstrates the extent to which his sense of personal worth had become dependent on external validation and competitive success, creating a psychological dynamic where any threat to his chosen source of meaning becomes an existential crisis, requiring immediate and overwhelming response. The famous "I thought this was America" outburst that emerged from his baseball altercations encapsulates the entitled mindset that would drive increasingly destructive behavior throughout his character arc, revealing someone who views any limitation on his actions as fundamental violation of his rights rather than reasonable social boundaries designed to protect others from harm. This rhetorical appeal to abstract principles while ignoring concrete consequences would become a defining characteristic of Randy's approach to moral reasoning, allowing him to justify increasingly harmful behavior by framing it as principled resistance to oppression. The rapid fan embrace of Randy's more aggressive persona created feedback loops between audience response and creative direction that would ultimately reshape South Park's entire identity, demonstrating how character popularity can drive narrative choices in directions that serve entertainment value rather than storytelling coherence or moral clarity. The positive reception of his chaotic behavior encouraged further exploration of his darker impulses, creating a creative dynamic where his worst qualities became his most celebrated characteristics. The shift from protective father figure to attention-seeking adult child represents one of the most psychologically complex aspects of Randy's evolution, revealing how parental authority can become corrupted when adults begin competing with their children for significance and recognition, rather than providing stable foundations for healthy development. His increasing willingness to prioritize his own emotional needs over his family's welfare demonstrates the breakdown of healthy generational boundaries and the emergence of narcissistic patterns that would define his later relationships. The alcohol abuse storylines that began appearing during this transitional period provide crucial insight into the underlying psychological pain driving Randy's increasingly extreme behavior, suggesting that his surface chaos masks deeper patterns of depression and anxiety that he lacks the emotional tools to address constructively. His relationship with drinking reveals someone who has learned to use external substances and activities to regulate internal emotional states, rather than developing genuine coping skills or seeking appropriate support for his bounty. Psychological struggles. The way Randy's drinking affects his family dynamics demonstrates how individual dysfunction creates ripple effects throughout entire family systems, forcing other family members to adapt their behavior patterns to accommodate and manage his unpredictability, while sacrificing their own needs and development in service of maintaining minimal family stability. Sharon's responses to his alcohol-fueled behavior reveal a woman caught between loyalty to her marriage and responsibility for protecting her children, creating impossible choices that reflect the broader social failure to address addiction as public health issue rather than individual moral failing. The midlife crisis elements that become increasingly apparent in Randy's behavior suggest someone who has reached the psychological developmental stage, where mortality awareness creates urgent pressure to achieve significance before death, but who lacks the emotional maturity and self-awareness necessary to pursue meaningful goals through constructive methods. His desperate attempts to recapture youth and relevance through various schemes and obsessions reflect the common masculine crisis of middle age, where social expectations of stoic competence collide with internal experiences of confusion and inadequacy. The relationship between Randy's geological expertise and his environmental activism reveals the complex ways that professional identity can become entangled with personal psychology, creating situations where legitimate concerns about ecological crisis become vehicles for personal aggrandizement rather than genuine efforts to address serious problems. His ability to speak authoritatively about scientific topics lends credibility to his pronouncements, while masking the fact that his motivations are primarily narcissistic rather than altruistic. The pattern of enthusiastic embrace, followed by catastrophic failure that characterizes Randy's approach to new interests and activities, reflects deeper psychological patterns related to addiction and compulsive behavior, suggesting someone who uses external stimulation and achievement to regulate internal emotional states, rather than developing sustainable sources of satisfaction and meaning. His inability to maintain moderate engagement with any activity or interest demonstrates the all-or-nothing thinking patterns that drive addictive cycles and prevent healthy relationship development. The way Randy's schemes consistently create problems that extend far beyond his immediate intentions reveals someone whose capacity for systems thinking remains severely limited despite his scientific training, suggesting that emotional dysfunction can override intellectual capability when personal needs become overwhelming. His repeated surprise at the negative consequences of his actions demonstrates a fundamental failure of empathy and perspective-taking that prevents him from learning from experience or modifying his behavior patterns in response to feedback. The increasing frequency and intensity of Randy's disruptive behaviors over time suggests someone caught in escalating cycles where each attempt to achieve satisfaction or significance requires more extreme measures than the last, creating addictive patterns that drive progressively more dangerous and harmful activities. His inability to find contentment in normal family and community relationships forces him to seek increasingly exotic sources of stimulation and recognition, creating unsustainable psychological dynamics that inevitably lead to crisis and collapse. The transformation of Randy from background character to central figure represents more than individual character development. It reflects broader cultural shifts in how American masculinity expresses itself when traditional sources of meaning and identity become unavailable or insufficient to meet psychological needs. His journey from competent professional to chaotic attention seeker mirrors the experiences of many middle-aged American men who find themselves unprepared for the emotional challenges of modern life, while lacking access to appropriate resources for addressing their struggles. Constructively, in the gentle contemplation of Randy's early evolution, we recognize the seeds of future destruction already present in those first moments of apparent normalcy, waiting for the right combination of circumstances and opportunity to bloom into the full chaos that would eventually consume not only his own life, but the lives of everyone around him. His transformation serves as a reminder that character is not fixed but fluid, shaped by choices and circumstances that can lead even apparently stable individuals down paths they never intended to travel, creating consequences that extend far beyond their ability to predict or control. In the fascinating psychology of human decision-making, certain individuals possess cognitive patterns that consistently lead them toward choices that maximize immediate gratification while minimizing consideration of long-term consequences, creating behavioral cycles that repeat with such reliability that they become defining characteristics of personality rather than isolated instances of poor judgment. Randy Marsh represents the perfect specimen for studying this phenomenon, demonstrating through countless episodes how intelligent, educated individuals can develop decision-making frameworks so fundamentally flawed that they consistently produce outcomes diametrically opposed to their stated goals and values. His pattern of self-destruction reveals the complex interplay between narcissistic personality traits, addictive thinking patterns, and the kind of privileged insulation from consequences that allows destructive behavior to flourish unchecked until it reaches catastrophic proportions. The psychological architecture underlying Randy's decision-making process operates through what mental health professionals recognize as a profound disconnect between intention and execution, where surface-level goals become corrupted by deeper psychological needs that remain largely unconscious and therefore unexamined. His consistent pattern of entering situations with apparently reasonable objectives, only to allow those objectives to become overwhelmed by more primitive drives for attention, significance, and immediate pleasure, reveals someone whose executive function has been compromised by unresolved emotional issues that express themselves through increasingly elaborate forms of self-sabotage and harm to others. The neurological basis for Randy's impulsivity suggests someone whose prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for planning and consequence evaluation, has been chronically overwhelmed by limbic system activation related to stress, anxiety, and unmet psychological needs. This biochemical imbalance creates a cognitive state where immediate emotional reactions consistently override rational analysis, leading to decisions that feel compelling in the moment but prove devastating when viewed from broader temporal and social perspectives. His inability to pause and consider alternatives before acting reflects the kind of executive dysfunction commonly associated with addiction, trauma, and personality disorders. The role of immediate gratification in Randy's psychological makeup reveals someone who has never successfully developed the capacity for delayed satisfaction that characterizes healthy, adult functioning and successful long-term planning. His consistent choice of short-term pleasure over long-term benefit demonstrates the kind of cognitive immaturity that prevents individuals from building sustainable relationships, careers, and life circumstances creating cycles where immediate choices consistently undermine future possibilities and force increasingly desperate attempts to restore equilibrium through ever more extreme measures. The specific mechanisms through which Randi rationalizes harmful behavior demonstrate sophisticated psychological defense systems that allow him to maintain positive self-image while engaging in activities that would typically create cognitive dissonance and moral distress in individuals with healthier psychological development. His ability to reframe selfish actions as altruistic gestures, destructive behavior as necessary intervention, and harmful consequences as unforeseeable accidents reveals the kind of motivated reasoning that characterizes narcissistic personality organization and prevents genuine learning from experience. The way Randi's privilege shields him from immediate consequences creates psychological conditions that reinforce rather than correct his dysfunctional decision-making patterns, demonstrating how social and economic advantages can become liabilities when they prevent individuals from receiving the kind of direct feedback that might motivate behavioral change. His middle-class status, professional credentials, and social connections consistently provide escape routes from the natural consequences of his actions, creating moral hazard situations where he bears minimal cost for decisions that impose significant harm on others. The cyclical nature of Randi's behavioral patterns reveals someone trapped in what addiction specialists recognize as chronic relapse cycles, where periods of apparent stability and good intentions are inevitably followed by episodes of increasingly extreme acting out that undoes any progress made during intervening periods. His inability to maintain behavioral changes over time suggests underlying psychological issues that remain unaddressed and continue to drive compulsive behavior despite repeated evidence of its harmful consequences. The escalation pattern visible across Randi's various schemes and obsessions demonstrates how untreated psychological dysfunction tends to worsen over time rather than resolving naturally, creating situations where each successive episode of poor judgment must be more extreme than the last in order to provide the same level of psychological satisfaction and external attention. This progressive intensification reflects the tolerance phenomenon familiar from substance abuse, where increasing doses of stimulation are required to achieve previously satisfying effects. The narcissistic elements that pervade Randi's decision-making process reveal someone whose fundamental relationship with reality has been distorted by an inflated sense of personal importance and a corresponding inability to accurately assess his own capabilities, limitations, and impact on others. His consistent overestimation of his expertise and underestimation of potential negative consequences creates decision-making conditions where catastrophic failure becomes virtually inevitable, yet his psychological defenses prevent him from recognizing these patterns or modifying his approach accordingly. The way Randi's schemes consistently involve manipulating or exploiting other people demonstrates someone whose empathy and perspective-taking abilities have been severely compromised by his narcissistic psychological organization, creating interpersonal dynamics where other individuals become objects to be used in service of his goals rather than autonomous beings deserving of consideration and respect. His inability to recognize or care about the harm his actions cause to others reveals the kind of profound empathy deficit that characterizes antisocial personality patterns. The relationship between Randi's educational background and his catastrophic decision-making reveals the complex ways that intellectual capability can be corrupted when it serves psychological dysfunction rather than genuine problem-solving and growth. His geological training and scientific knowledge become tools for rationalizing predetermined conclusions rather than methods for objective analysis, demonstrating how expertise can be weaponized in service of pathological needs rather than serving its intended purpose of expanding understanding and improving outcomes. The specific role of alcohol and other substances in Randy's decision-making process reveals someone who uses external chemical intervention to manage internal psychological states rather than developing healthy coping mechanisms and emotional regulation skills. His relationship with intoxication demonstrates how substance use can become integrated into dysfunctional behavioral patterns, providing temporary relief from psychological distress while simultaneously creating conditions that make poor decision-making more likely and consequences more severe. The way Randy's poor choices consistently create emergencies that require other people to manage and resolve demonstrates his fundamental failure to take responsibility for the consequences of his actions, creating family and community dynamics where others must constantly adapt their lives to accommodate and mitigate his dysfunction. This pattern of externalizing costs while internalizing benefits reflects the kind of parasitic relationship style that characterizes many personality disorders and addiction patterns. The temporal patterns visible in Randy's decision-making reveal someone whose relationship with time and consequences has been severely distorted by his psychological dysfunction, creating cognitive frameworks where future costs are heavily discounted relative to immediate benefits and where past failures are minimized or forgotten rather than integrated into improved decision-making processes. His inability to learn from experience reflects the kind of cognitive rigidity that prevents behavioral change despite repeated negative consequences. The social dynamics that enable Randy's continued poor decision-making demonstrate how individual dysfunction can become embedded in larger systems that inadvertently support and maintain problematic behavior rather than creating accountability and opportunities for positive change. The community's tolerance for his chaos and the family's adaptation to his dysfunction create environmental conditions where his behavior is normalized rather than challenged, preventing the kind of external pressure that might motivate genuine self-examination and behavioral modification. The way Randy's decision-making process involves elaborate rationalization systems reveals someone whose relationship with truth and reality has become subordinated to his psychological needs for significance and control, creating cognitive frameworks where facts are selectively interpreted or ignored when they conflict with predetermined emotional conclusions. This motivated reasoning prevents genuine problem-solving and ensures that his approaches to challenges will be based on wishful thinking rather than accurate assessment of circumstances and realistic planning. The economic dimensions of Randy's poor decision-making reveal how financial resources can become tools for avoiding consequences, rather than building sustainable life circumstances, creating patterns where money is used to escape problems, rather than address their underlying causes. His willingness to spend significant resources on schemes and impulses, while ignoring basic family and community responsibilities, demonstrates how economic privilege can enable rather than constrain destructive behavior. The generational impact of Randy's decision-making patterns reveals how individual dysfunction creates ripple effects that extend beyond immediate family members to influence community dynamics and social institutions that must adapt to accommodate his chaos. His consistent failure to fulfill adult responsibilities forces others to compensate for his deficits, while creating modeling effects that may influence younger community members' understanding of appropriate adult behavior and social responsibility. The psychological toll that Randy's decision-making patterns impose on family members demonstrates how individual dysfunction creates trauma and stress that affects everyone within the family system, forcing adaptation patterns that may compromise others' development and well-being in service of managing his unpredictability. The chronic stress and uncertainty created by his behavior create family dynamics characterized by hypervigilance and crisis management rather than healthy growth and mutual support. The way Randy's poor choices consistently escalate minor situations into major crises reveals someone whose cognitive and emotional regulation systems are fundamentally calibrated incorrectly, creating response patterns where proportionality and appropriate intensity become impossible to maintain. His tendency to apply maximum effort and dramatic intervention to minor problems while ignoring or minimizing genuine, serious issues demonstrates the kind of judgment dysfunction that makes effective life management impossible. The role of fantasy and magical thinking in Randy's decision-making process reveals someone whose relationship with reality has been compromised by psychological needs for omnipotence and control that prevent accurate assessment of limitations and constraints. His consistent overestimation of his ability to control outcomes and underestimation of the complexity of systems he attempts to manipulate creates decision-making frameworks guaranteed to produce unintended consequences and collateral damage. The community-level impact of Randy's decision-making patterns demonstrates how individual dysfunction can become socialized and normalized when systems lack effective mechanisms for containing harmful behavior and protecting vulnerable community members from its consequences. His ability to consistently escape accountability while imposing costs on others reveals systemic failures in social institutions designed to maintain community standards and protect collective welfare. In the quiet recognition of these patterns, we observe how individual psychological dysfunction can become embedded in larger social and family systems that inadvertently support, rather than correct, destructive behavior, creating cycles where harm perpetuates itself across generations and communities until external intervention or internal crisis finally forces confrontation with reality that has been systematically avoided through elaborate psychological and social defense mechanisms. In the disturbing taxonomy of self-inflicted harm perpetrated in service of recreational drug access, few incidents reveal as much about the intersection of privilege, addiction psychology, and moral bankruptcy as Randy Marsh's deliberate induction of testicular cancer to obtain medical marijuana. This episode represents far more than comedic exaggeration of drug-seeking behavior. It constitutes a profound exploration of how certain individuals can rationalize causing themselves serious physical harm when their psychological dependencies override basic self-preservation, instincts, and moral reasoning. The calculated nature of his self-mutilation, combined with his subsequent social performance around his manufactured illness, demonstrates the sophisticated psychological mechanisms through which addiction can corrupt not only decision-making processes, but fundamental concepts of truth, suffering, and human dignity. The initial premise that drives Randy toward this extreme measure reveals someone whose relationship with marijuana has already progressed far beyond casual recreational use into the realm of psychological dependency that demands increasingly desperate measures to maintain access. His immediate fixation on the medical marijuana dispensary as soon as it opens demonstrates the kind of single-minded focus characteristic of addictive thinking, where obstacles to substance access become challenges to be overcome through any means necessary, rather than natural boundaries that might suggest the need for self-examination and behavioral modification. The psychological process through which Randy rationalizes deliberately giving himself cancer demonstrates the sophisticated cognitive distortions that characterize advanced addiction, where consequences that would horrify healthy individuals become acceptable costs in service of maintaining substance access. His ability to minimize the genuine suffering associated with cancer while maximizing the perceived benefits of legal marijuana access reveals someone whose risk assessment capabilities have been fundamentally compromised by compulsive psychological processes that override rational decision-making and basic self-care instincts. The specific method Randy chooses for inducing his cancer, deliberately exposing his testicles to radiation from a microwave oven, reveals both his crude understanding of oncology and his willingness to engage in behavior that carries enormous potential for permanent damage, extending far beyond his intended consequences. The symbolic significance of his choice to target his reproductive organs suggests unconscious psychological processes related to masculinity, virility, and the ways that addictive behavior can represent a form of slow-motion suicide that attacks the very biological foundations of life and regeneration. The enlargement of his testicles that results from his radiation exposure becomes both literal manifestation of his psychological grandiosity and grotesque parody of masculine enhancement fantasies, creating a physical condition that simultaneously grants him the victim status he desires, while making him an object of fascination and revulsion. The massive size of his affected organs serves as external representation of his internal psychological inflation, demonstrating how his need for attention and specialness has literally reshaped his body in ways that make normal social functioning impossible. The social dynamics that emerge around Randy's manufactured medical condition reveal the complex ways that genuine illness can become commodified and performed when it serves psychological needs for attention and social positioning, rather than representing authentic suffering requiring compassion and support. His obvious enjoyment of his condition and the special treatment it affords him demonstrates how certain personality types can weaponize victim status to gain advantages and sympathy, while avoiding the genuine vulnerability and humility that characterize authentic medical crises. The bragging behavior that Randy exhibits around his cancer diagnosis represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his entire scheme, revealing someone whose psychological relationship with suffering has been so fundamentally distorted that he can experience genuine pride in his self-inflicted illness rather than the shame and regret that would characterize healthy responses to such extreme self-harm. His ability to frame his cancer as an achievement rather than a tragedy demonstrates the complete breakdown of normal, moral, and emotional categories that occurs when addiction and narcissism combine to create pathological worldviews. The specific ways Randy flaunts his marijuana access to his friends reveal someone whose primary satisfaction comes not from the substance itself, but from the social positioning and superiority that exclusive access provides, suggesting that his addiction involves power and status dynamics as much as chemical dependency. His refusal to share his marijuana with friends who lack medical conditions demonstrates how his supposed medical need quickly becomes transformed into an opportunity for social dominance and exclusion, rather than genuine therapeutic intervention. The encouragement that Randy provides to his friends to give themselves cancer so they can join him in legal marijuana access represents one of the most morally bankrupt aspects of his entire scheme, revealing someone whose need for social validation and companionship in his destructive behavior overrides any concern for others' welfare or safety. His active recruitment of others into self-harm demonstrates how individual dysfunction can become contagious when it offers apparent solutions to shared psychological needs and social pressures. The ripple effect that Randy's bragging creates throughout his social network demonstrates how individual choices around substance use and medical manipulation can influence community norms and behavior patterns in ways that extend far beyond immediate participants. The spread of self-inflicted cancer among his friend group reveals how social proof and peer pressure can amplify destructive individual choices into community-wide health crises when underlying psychological needs remain unaddressed through healthier channels. The ultimate consequence of Randy's scheme, the recriminalization of marijuana in South Park, represents perfect poetic justice that demonstrates how selfish behavior, disguised as medical need, can undermine legitimate policy reforms and harm genuinely suffering individuals who depend on compassionate medical policies for actual relief from serious conditions. His personal gratification destroys the very system that enabled it, creating a feedback loop where his addiction literally devours the resources it depends upon for satisfaction. The impact on genuine medical marijuana patients who lose access due to Randy's abuse of the system reveals the broader social costs of individual moral failure, demonstrating how privilege and resources can be weaponized in ways that harm vulnerable populations who lack the social capital and connections necessary to maintain access when policies become restrictive. His actions represent a form of medical gentrification, where recreational users appropriate medical resources and subsequently destroy them through irresponsible behavior. The way Randy's enlarged testicles affect his mobility and daily functioning creates physical consequences that mirror the psychological and social dysfunction his behavior has already created, making his internal pathology visible through external symptoms that cannot be hidden or denied. The wheelchair and mobility aids he requires serve as constant reminders of the costs of his choices, while simultaneously providing him with additional victim status and special treatment that feeds his psychological needs. The medical interventions required to manage Randy's self-inflicted condition consume healthcare resources and professional time that could be directed toward patients with genuine medical needs, creating opportunity costs that extend his individual dysfunction into broader healthcare system impacts. The doctors and nurses who must treat his deliberately induced illness are forced to provide expensive and complex care for entirely preventable conditions, while patients with genuine medical crises may face delayed or reduced access to necessary treatment. The psychological profile that emerges from Randy's cancer scheme reveals someone whose relationship with his own body has become fundamentally instrumental rather than protective, viewing physical health and integrity as resources to be manipulated and sacrificed in service of psychological and social goals, rather than as intrinsic goods deserving of care and protection. This disconnection from basic self-preservation suggests deeper psychological pathology that extends beyond simple addiction into realms of self-harm and deliberate self-destruction. The family dynamics that develop around Randy's medical condition force Sharon and Stan into caretaker roles that they neither chose nor are equipped to handle, creating additional layers of psychological burden and role confusion within the family system. Their need to provide support for his manufactured illness, while recognizing its voluntary and manipulative nature, creates impossible emotional situations where appropriate responses become unclear and family bonds are strained by resentment and ethical confusion. The economic costs associated with Randy's cancer treatment, including medical bills, lost productivity, and adaptive equipment, represent financial burdens that extend the consequences of his individual choice throughout the family's economic circumstances and future planning. The money spent on managing his self-inflicted condition reduces resources available for other family needs and goals, creating additional stress and limitation that compounds the emotional and social costs of his behavior. The way Randy's cancer affects his professional functioning and community responsibilities demonstrates how individual health choices create ripple effects throughout all areas of life, forcing adaptations and accommodations that may compromise his effectiveness in roles and relationships that others depend upon. His geological work and community involvement become secondary to managing his medical condition, creating service gaps that affect both economic productivity and social cohesion. The psychological impact on Stan of witnessing his father deliberately harm himself for recreational drug access creates complex emotional responses involving shame, anger, confusion, and protective anxiety that may influence his own future relationships with substances and authority figures. The modeling effect of Randy's extreme self-harm teaches dangerous lessons about acceptable risk-taking and the relative value of immediate gratification versus long-term health and stability. The broader commentary that Randy's cancer scheme provides about American healthcare, drug policy, and the commodification of medical conditions reveals how individual psychological pathology can exploit and expose systemic weaknesses in social institutions designed to provide compassionate care for genuine suffering. His abuse of medical marijuana policies demonstrates how well-intentioned reforms can be corrupted when they fail to account for the sophisticated manipulation tactics employed by individuals with addictive and narcissistic personality patterns. The ultimate futility of Randy's elaborate scheme, which succeeds in obtaining marijuana access but destroys the very system that enabled that access, demonstrates the self-defeating nature of addictive thinking patterns that consistently undermine their own goals through excessive and inappropriate behavior. His inability to use medical marijuana discreetly and appropriately reveals how addiction creates compulsive patterns that prevent sustainable satisfaction and force increasingly extreme measures that ultimately prove counterproductive. In the gentle contemplation of Randy's cancer scheme, we recognize how individual psychological dysfunction can metastasize through social systems in ways that mirror the cellular chaos of actual malignancy, spreading harm and consuming resources while providing no genuine benefit to anyone involved. His willingness to inflict serious physical harm upon himself in service of recreational drug access serves as a powerful reminder that privilege and education provide no protection against the profound moral corruption that can result when addiction combines with narcissism to create behavioral patterns that sacrifice everything meaningful in service of immediate gratification and social positioning. In the dark psychology of intimate manipulation, few behaviors reveal as much about the corruption of trust and the weaponization of shared cultural experiences as Randy Marsh's systematic use of Broadway entertainment to control his wife's sexual behavior. This calculated campaign of psychological manipulation disguised as romantic gesture represents far more than crude attempts at marital enhancement. It constitutes a comprehensive exploration of how certain individuals can transform legitimate artistic expression into instruments of coercion and control, demonstrating the sophisticated methods through which abusive partners can exploit their victims' genuine appreciation for beauty and culture while maintaining plausible deniability about their true intentions. The progression from personal manipulation to lethal violence reveals how seemingly harmless deceptions can escalate into genuine threats to human life when the manipulator's control is challenged or threatened. The initial discovery that drives Randy's Broadway scheme emerges from workplace conversations that should have remained casual observations about cultural phenomena, but instead become operational intelligence for systematic, psychological manipulation campaigns. His co-workers' casual comments about the apparent correlation between Broadway attendance and increased female sexual interest provide Randy with what he perceives as actionable information rather than amusing cultural observation, revealing someone whose approach to marriage has become fundamentally strategic rather than based on genuine emotional connection and mutual respect. The psychological profile that emerges from Randy's immediate embrace of Broadway manipulation demonstrates someone whose relationship with his wife has devolved into a series of transactions and control mechanisms rather than authentic intimacy based on trust, communication, and mutual desire. His inability to consider alternative approaches to marital enhancement, such as honest conversation about needs and desires, or genuine efforts to improve emotional connection, reveals someone who views relationships as systems to be gamed rather than bonds to be nurtured through patience and genuine care. The specific methodology Randy employs in his Broadway campaign reveals sophisticated understanding of behavioral conditioning principles, combined with complete absence of ethical consideration for the psychological impact of his deceptions on his target. His systematic exposure of Sharon to Broadway productions, while monitoring her responses, demonstrates the kind of calculated approach typically associated with psychological research or therapeutic intervention, yet deployed without consent or awareness, in service of purely selfish gratification rather than mutual benefit or healing. The escalation from attending existing Broadway shows to creating original productions specifically designed to manipulate Sharon's behavior represents a profound deepening of his commitment to deception and control that reveals someone whose investment in manipulation has progressed beyond casual opportunism into the realm of elaborate psychological architecture designed to reshape another person's responses and desires. The time, energy, and resources invested in creating theatrical productions for manipulation purposes demonstrate how completely his relationship priorities have become oriented around control rather than connection. The psychological mechanisms through which Randy's Broadway manipulation operates rely on exploiting Sharon's genuine appreciation for artistic expression and cultural sophistication, transforming her authentic responses to beauty and creativity into involuntary triggers for behaviors that serve his desires, rather than expressing her own autonomous choices. This weaponization of aesthetic experience represents a particularly insidious form of abuse that corrupts the victim's relationship with cultural activities that previously provided genuine pleasure and meaning. The way Randy frames his Broadway manipulation as generous romantic gestures rather than calculated psychological control demonstrates the sophisticated rationalization systems that characterize manipulative personalities, allowing him to maintain positive self-image while engaging in behavior that would be recognized as abusive if its true nature were acknowledged. His ability to recast exploitation as generosity reveals the kind of cognitive distortion that prevents genuine self-reflection and behavioral change. The discovery that his daughter Shelley is attending a musical with a romantic interest creates a crisis point where Randy's manipulative worldview collides with his protective parental instincts, forcing him to confront the implications of his own behavior when applied to his child rather than his spouse. His recognition that the same Broadway manipulation he employs against Sharon could be used by others to exploit his daughter reveals the fundamental contradiction in his moral reasoning that allows him to perpetrate harm he would never accept being inflicted upon those he wishes to protect. The psychological complexity of Randy's response to his daughter's potential manipulation reveals someone whose protective instincts can override his manipulative patterns when family honor and parental authority are threatened, yet who remains completely unable to recognize the parallel between his own behavior and the exploitation he fears his daughter might experience. This cognitive blind spot demonstrates how psychological defenses can create selective moral awareness that protects the ego while maintaining harmful behavioral patterns. The decision to sabotage the Broadway production through violent intervention represents Randy's choice of destructive action over honest communication as his preferred method of addressing perceived threats to his family's welfare. Rather than discussing his concerns with Shelley or addressing the situation through appropriate social channels, he chooses elaborate deception and property destruction that reflects his fundamental preference for dramatic action over responsible, adult problem-solving approaches. The Spider-Man impersonation that Randy employs as cover for his sabotage operation reveals both his disconnection from reality and his sophisticated understanding of how cultural symbols and identities can be appropriated to provide psychological cover for antisocial behavior. His assumption of a fictional heroic identity while engaging in clearly destructive and illegal activities demonstrates how certain personality types can use fantasy and role-playing to rationalize behavior that contradicts their stated values and social responsibilities. The water pipe destruction that Randy causes during his sabotage attempt represents the kind of collateral damage that inevitably results when individuals choose dramatic intervention over measured response to perceived problems. His focus on stopping the performance prevents him from considering the broader infrastructure implications of his actions, creating dangerous conditions that extend far beyond his intended targets to threaten innocent bystanders who have no involvement in the situation he seeks to address. The accidental death of Larry that results from Randy's water pipe destruction represents the ultimate consequence of choosing violence and sabotage over communication and appropriate intervention when addressing family concerns. The young man's death transforms Randy's manipulation concerns from minor family drama into genuine tragedy that demonstrates how individual moral failures can escalate into irreversible harm that destroys lives and traumatizes communities through completely preventable chains of cause and effect. The psychological impact of causing Larry's death through his sabotage operation creates a level of guilt and responsibility that Randy's defense mechanisms prove incapable of processing appropriately, forcing him to employ increasingly elaborate rationalization systems to avoid confronting the magnitude of harm his choices have created. His inability to accept full responsibility for the death demonstrates how psychological defenses can prevent genuine remorse and learning, even when consequences reach catastrophic levels. The way Randy frames Larry's death as an unfortunate accident, rather than the predictable consequence of his reckless and illegal behavior, reveals someone whose relationship with causation and responsibility has been fundamentally corrupted by his need to maintain positive self-image. Despite engaging in consistently harmful actions, his attribution of the death to external forces rather than his own choices prevents the kind of genuine accountability that might motivate behavioral change and moral growth. The impact of Larry's death on Shelley creates traumatic consequences that extend Randy's manipulation campaign into his daughter's psychological development and future relationship patterns, forcing her to process both grief over her friend's death and confusion about her father's role in creating the circumstances that led to the tragedy. The intersection of romantic disappointment with violent loss creates complex emotional responses that may influence her approach to relationships and trust throughout her adult life. The community response to the Broadway production disaster and Larry's death reveals how individual manipulation campaigns can create broader social consequences that affect entire communities and cultural institutions, forcing others to bear the costs and trauma associated with one person's refusal to address personal problems through appropriate channels. The theater community and educational institutions must now process both immediate crisis response and longer-term policy implications to prevent similar tragedies. The legal and social consequences that Randy faces as a result of Larry's death remain largely unexplored, reflecting the characteristic pattern of his privilege, shielding him from accountability, while others bear the primary costs of his behavior. The lack of appropriate legal response to his role in creating the deadly situation demonstrates systemic failures to hold individuals accountable for harm caused through reckless and illegal behavior disguised as protective family interventions. The psychological profile that emerges from Randy's Broadway manipulation campaign reveals someone whose capacity for genuine intimate connection has been replaced by strategic thinking and control mechanisms that reduce other human beings to objects to be manipulated rather than autonomous, individuals deserving of respect and honest communication. His approach to both marital and parental relationships demonstrates the profound empathy deficits that characterize abusive personality patterns. The way Randy's manipulation campaign affects his marriage long-term remains largely unexamined, but the foundation of deception and control he has established through his Broadway scheme creates relationship dynamics based on false premises rather than genuine mutual attraction and respect. Sharon's responses to Broadway productions have been artificially conditioned rather than representing authentic expressions of desire, creating intimacy based on manipulation rather than genuine connection. The broader cultural commentary embedded in Randy's Broadway manipulation reveals how artistic expression and cultural sophistication can be corrupted when they serve psychological manipulation rather than genuine aesthetic, appreciation, and shared meaning-making. His transformation of legitimate theatrical art into weapons of psychological control demonstrates how any human activity can be perverted when it serves pathological needs rather than healthy human development and connection. The escalation pattern visible in Randy's progression from casual Broadway attendance to original production creation to violent sabotage demonstrates how manipulation campaigns tend to intensify over time when they provide psychological satisfaction to their perpetrators, creating addiction-like patterns where increasingly extreme measures become necessary to maintain the same level of control and gratification. This escalation makes violence and tragedy virtually inevitable when external factors threaten the manipulator's sense of control and dominance. In the somber recognition of Larry's preventable death and the trauma inflicted on Shelley and Sharon through Randy's manipulation campaigns, we observe how individual moral corruption can metastasize through families and communities in ways that transform private dysfunction into public tragedy, demonstrating that no manipulation exists in isolation and that the psychological violence perpetrated in intimate relationships inevitably extends its reach to harm innocent individuals who become collateral damage in one person's desperate quest for control and significance at the expense of truth, trust, and human dignity. In the disturbing psychology of compulsive behavior and resource hoarding, few incidents reveal as much about the intersection of addiction, privilege, and social responsibility as Randy Marsh's systematic monopolization of limited internet access during a nationwide digital crisis. His transformation of what should have been a shared community resource into a vehicle for personal gratification demonstrates the profound ways that individual pathology can corrupt collective problem-solving efforts and impose devastating costs on vulnerable populations who depend on equitable access to essential services. The 40-second time limit that was established to ensure fair distribution among desperate refugees becomes meaningless when confronted with someone whose compulsive needs override all consideration for others' welfare, and whose social position provides sufficient leverage to circumvent reasonable restrictions designed to protect community resources. The nationwide internet outage that creates the crisis conditions for Randy's behavior represents the kind of large-scale infrastructure failure that reveals both individual character and community resilience when essential services suddenly become scarce and precious. The fact that only limited internet access remains available in specific California locations transforms digital connectivity from ubiquitous utility into valuable commodity that must be carefully managed and equitably distributed to maximize benefit for the greatest number of people affected by the crisis. The refugee camp setting that emerges around the remaining internet access points creates social dynamics reminiscent of disaster relief operations, where normal social hierarchies and market mechanisms become suspended in favor of humanitarian principles designed to ensure that basic needs are met fairly among all affected populations. The numbering system and time limitations represent reasonable attempts to create orderly and equitable access that prevents powerful or aggressive individuals from monopolizing resources that should serve entire communities in crisis. The psychological profile that drives Randy to seek internet access during this crisis reveals someone whose relationship with digital pornography has progressed far beyond casual recreational use into the realm of compulsive addiction that creates genuine withdrawal symptoms and desperate behavior when access is restricted. His willingness to uproot his entire family and travel across the country in pursuit of internet access demonstrates the extent to which his online activities have become central organizing principles in his life that override normal considerations of cost, convenience, and family stability. The specific nature of Randy's internet addiction, focused primarily on accessing increasingly extreme pornographic content, reveals someone whose sexuality has become fundamentally dependent on external stimulation and novel experiences rather than intimate connection with his spouse or healthy personal fantasy development. His progression toward more extreme and culturally specific pornographic material suggests tolerance patterns common in behavioral addictions, where baseline stimulation becomes insufficient and increasingly intense experiences become necessary to achieve satisfaction. The 40-second time limit established for equitable internet access represents a carefully calculated compromise designed to provide meaningful access while ensuring that resources remain available for the maximum number of people seeking essential services during the crisis. This restriction reflects sophisticated understanding of queuing theory and resource management that prioritizes collective welfare over individual satisfaction when resources are severely constrained and demand far exceeds supply capacity. Randy's immediate disregard for the established time limitations reveals someone whose compulsive needs have completely overwhelmed his capacity for social cooperation and basic consideration for others facing the same crisis. Circumstances, his inability to accept that his personal desires should be subject to the same restrictions that govern everyone else's access, demonstrates the kind of entitlement and grandiosity that characterizes both addiction and narcissistic personality patterns. The systematic methods Randy employs to circumvent access restrictions and consume disproportionate amounts of limited internet resources reveal sophisticated manipulation tactics and complete absence of ethical consideration for the community members who are denied access as a result of his hoarding behavior. His ability to game the system while maintaining plausible deniability about his actions demonstrates the kind of calculated selfishness that transforms individual pathology into community-wide harm. The consumption of entire internet bandwidth capacity through Randy's pornographic activities represents the ultimate expression of his addictive and narcissistic pathology, where his individual gratification literally prevents anyone else from accessing essential digital services that might be necessary for emergency communication, medical information, or other life-critical applications. His monopolization of shared resources demonstrates how individual compulsive behavior can impose catastrophic costs on entire communities when appropriate boundaries and enforcement mechanisms are absent. The explosive nature of Randy's sexual release that accompanies his internet consumption creates additional layers of public health and social decency concerns that extend his private pathology into shared community spaces where others are forced to witness and clean up after his compulsive behavior. The physical evidence of his activities becomes impossible to ignore or rationalize, creating community-wide awareness of his exploitation of shared resources for personal gratification. The impact on other refugees who are denied internet access due to Randy's resource hoarding creates genuine hardship and emergency situations for individuals who may need digital connectivity for essential communications with family members, medical professionals, employers, or emergency services. His selfish consumption transforms their legitimate needs into unmet crises that may have serious consequences for their safety, health, and economic security during an already challenging disaster situation. The psychological mechanisms that allow Randy to rationalize his monopolization of community resources reveal sophisticated defense systems that permit him to maintain positive self-image while engaging in behavior that clearly harms vulnerable populations, depending on the same limited services. His ability to reframe his exploitation as somehow justified or necessary demonstrates the kind of motivated reasoning that prevents addictive individuals from recognizing the full scope of harm their behavior creates. The community response to Randy's resource hoarding reveals the complex social dynamics that emerge when individual pathology confronts collective crisis management efforts, forcing community leaders and fellow refugees to choose between confronting his behavior directly or finding alternative solutions that accommodate his dysfunction while attempting to maintain some level of service for others. The social pressure to avoid conflict often enables continued exploitation when direct intervention seems too costly or difficult to implement effectively. The family dynamics that develop around Randy's internet addiction and resource hoarding create impossible situations for Sharon and Stan, who must choose between supporting his clearly harmful behavior or confronting him in ways that might create additional family conflict during an already stressful crisis situation. Their enablement of his addiction through silence and accommodation demonstrates how individual pathology can corrupt entire family systems and prevent appropriate intervention. The destruction of community hope and morale that results from Randy's monopolization of internet access extends beyond immediate practical consequences to encompass psychological harm inflicted on people who had maintained optimism about accessing essential services but discover that individual selfishness can override community cooperation and mutual aid. The disappointment and despair created by his behavior may have lasting effects on community cohesion and trust. The way Randy's behavior affects children and vulnerable populations within the refugee community creates additional ethical dimensions to his resource hoarding, as his actions deny access to individuals who may need internet connectivity for educational purposes, medical information, or communication with caregivers and support networks. The harm inflicted on these vulnerable populations represents perhaps the most morally indefensible aspect of his entire exploitation campaign. The economic implications of Randy's internet consumption include the depletion of technical resources and infrastructure capacity that might otherwise serve legitimate business, educational, and emergency communication needs during the crisis period. The opportunity costs associated with his monopolization extend beyond immediate individual disappointment to encompass broader economic and social disruption that affects entire regional recovery efforts. The public health consequences that emerge from Randy's explicit sexual behavior in shared community spaces create sanitation and safety concerns that force other community members to manage contamination and health risks associated with his private activities conducted in public settings. The cleanup and health management costs associated with his behavior become additional burdens that the refugee community must bear, despite having no responsibility for creating these problems. The legal and regulatory implications of Randy's systematic circumvention of established access controls raise questions about enforcement mechanisms and penalty structures designed to protect community resources during emergency situations. His ability to exploit system weaknesses while avoiding consequences demonstrates how individual sophistication and persistence can undermine well-intentioned policies when they lack adequate enforcement mechanisms. The psychological trauma inflicted on community members who witness Randy's compulsive sexual behavior creates lasting mental health consequences that extend far beyond the immediate crisis period, forcing innocent individuals to process disturbing images and experiences that they neither chose nor deserved. The involuntary exposure to his private pathology becomes a form of sexual harassment that victimizes entire communities. The broader social commentary embedded in Randy's internet consumption reveals how individual addiction can exploit and corrupt community crisis response systems, transforming mutual aid efforts into opportunities for predatory behavior when adequate oversight and accountability mechanisms are absent. His exploitation of disaster relief resources for personal gratification demonstrates how individual pathology can undermine collective resilience and social cooperation during times when community solidarity is most essential. The long-term community consequences of Randy's behavior include the destruction of trust and cooperation that are necessary for effective crisis response and community recovery efforts, creating social fragmentation and conflict that may persist long after internet access is restored and immediate crisis conditions have passed. The damage to community cohesion represents lasting harm that extends far beyond the immediate technical and resource problems his behavior created. In the sobering recognition of how Randy's compulsive behavior transformed community crisis into individual opportunity for exploitation, we observe the profound ways that untreated addiction and narcissistic pathology can corrupt even the most basic forms of human cooperation and mutual aid, demonstrating that individual moral failure can metastasize into community-wide trauma when personal pathology encounters vulnerable populations and limited resources without adequate protection and accountability mechanisms to prevent predatory behavior disguised as legitimate need. In the complex psychology of victim identity, appropriation, and the weaponization of disease concepts for personal advantage, few incidents reveal as much about the intersection of privilege, manipulation, and systematic avoidance of responsibility as Randy Marsh's transformation of a drunk driving arrest into an elaborate performance of disability and victimhood. His progression from legitimate legal consequences for endangering children's lives to manufactured medical crisis requiring miraculous intervention demonstrates the sophisticated psychological mechanisms through which certain individuals can corrupt legitimate social support systems while simultaneously avoiding accountability for genuinely harmful behavior that threatens community safety and family welfare. The initial drunk driving incident that precipitates Randy's elaborate deception represents a clear-cut case of criminal behavior that endangers not only his own life, but the lives of innocent children entrusted to his care during what should have been routine transportation. His decision to operate a vehicle while intoxicated with Cartman, Kyle, and Ike as passengers demonstrates the kind of reckless endangerment that reflects complete breakdown of adult responsibility and protective instincts that should govern interactions with vulnerable populations depending on adult supervision and safety. The legal consequences that follow Randy's arrest, including license revocation and mandatory attendance at Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, represent appropriate social responses designed to protect community safety while providing opportunities for behavioral change and recognition of the serious nature of impaired driving. These measured interventions reflect sophisticated understanding of addiction and behavioral modification that balance punishment with treatment opportunities that could facilitate genuine recovery and responsibility acceptance if approached with honesty and commitment to change. The psychological transformation that occurs when Randy encounters the disease model of alcoholism represents a crucial turning point where legitimate therapeutic concepts become corrupted and weaponized in service of avoiding responsibility rather than promoting genuine healing and behavioral change. His immediate embrace of the disease framework demonstrates how certain personality types can exploit well-intentioned medical and therapeutic models to transform themselves from perpetrators requiring accountability into victims deserving sympathy and special treatment. The wheelchair performance that Randy adopts following his exposure to disease model concepts reveals someone whose relationship with truth and authentic experience has become completely subordinated to his psychological needs for attention, sympathy, and avoidance of normal adult responsibilities and consequences. His assumption of disability status without any genuine physical impairment represents a form of identity theft that exploits and mocks individuals with actual disabilities while appropriating resources and accommodation meant for genuinely vulnerable populations. The elaborate theatrical elements that characterize Randy's disability performance, including specific props, behavioral modifications, and social presentations designed to convince others of his authentic helplessness, demonstrate sophisticated understanding of disability presentation, combined with complete absence of ethical consideration for the harmful effects his deception creates. His ability to maintain consistent performance across multiple social contexts reveals the kind of calculated manipulation that characterizes antisocial personality patterns and systematic exploitation of social support systems. The psychological needs that drive Randy's victim identity appropriation reveal someone whose fundamental relationship with responsibility and accountability has become so dysfunctional that he requires elaborate external structures and identity modifications to avoid confronting the basic reality that his choices have consequences and that adult behavior requires consideration for others' safety and welfare. His transformation into disabled victim represents the ultimate expression of his refusal to accept appropriate adult responsibilities and social obligations. The discovery of the Bleeding Virgin Mary statue creates the perfect external solution for Randy's manufactured crisis, providing him with supernatural intervention that allows him to maintain his disease and disability narrative while pursuing miraculous cure that would restore his functioning without requiring genuine behavioral change or acceptance of responsibility for his drunk driving and child endangerment. The religious miracle framework allows him to bypass normal processes of accountability and growth in favor of magical thinking and external intervention. The family dynamics that emerge around Randy's disability performance create impossible situations for Sharon and Stan, who must choose between supporting his clearly fraudulent medical claims or confronting him about his deception while he maintains the appearance of genuine suffering and helplessness. Their accommodation of his wheelchair use and disability theater demonstrates how individual manipulation can corrupt entire family systems and force others to participate in elaborate deceptions to maintain family stability. The forcing of Stan to drive illegally to reach the miracle statue represents perhaps the most morally indefensible aspect of Randy's entire deception campaign, as he literally recreates the same child endangerment behavior that initiated his legal troubles while framing it as necessary medical intervention rather than continued criminal activity. His willingness to expose his son to legal liability and safety risks while claiming disability status reveals the profound moral bankruptcy underlying his victim performance. The cue-cutting behavior that Randy exhibits at the miracle site demonstrates how his appropriation of victim status becomes immediately transformed into claims for special treatment and priority access that disadvantage genuinely suffering individuals seeking authentic medical or spiritual intervention. His belief that his manufactured alcoholism crisis deserves priority over others' legitimate medical conditions reveals the narcissistic grandiosity that drives his entire manipulation campaign. The interaction with genuinely ill and disabled individuals at the miracle site creates profound ethical complications as Randy's fraudulent disability performance mingles with authentic suffering and desperate hope for healing, corrupting the sacred space and exploiting the vulnerability of people facing real medical crises. His presence among legitimate sufferers represents a form of spiritual and medical fraud that mocks genuine pain while appropriating resources meant for authentic need. The psychological profile that emerges from Randy's miracle-seeking behavior reveals someone whose relationship with spirituality and divine intervention has become entirely instrumental and self-serving rather than based on genuine faith, humility, or gratitude for blessings received. His approach to religious experience demonstrates how sacred concepts and practices can be corrupted when they serve narcissistic needs rather than promoting genuine spiritual development and service to others. The N-word incident that occurs during this period creates additional layers of victim identity appropriation as Randy transforms his own racist language and social consequences into another opportunity for claiming victimhood and special treatment rather than accepting responsibility for harmful speech and its impact on marginalized communities. His ability to reframe his racist behavior as evidence of his own persecution demonstrates the sophisticated psychological defenses that prevent genuine accountability and moral growth. The Jesse Jackson interaction that follows Randy's racist language represents his continued pattern of seeking external validation and absolution rather than engaging in genuine self-examination and behavioral change that would address the underlying attitudes and beliefs that produced his harmful language. His literal buttocks-kissing performance demonstrates how his approach to conflict resolution focuses on theatrical gestures rather than authentic apology and commitment to behavioral modification. The N-word guy identity that Randy acquires following his television appearance creates additional opportunities for victim positioning as he reframes the social consequences of his racist language into evidence of persecution, discrimination against him, rather than appropriate community response to harmful behavior. His formation of support groups with other individuals who have used racist language demonstrates how victim identity can become basis for solidarity and mutual reinforcement rather than accountability and growth. The Washington lobbying effort that emerges from Randy's N-word guy identity represents the ultimate corruption of legitimate civil rights advocacy, as he and others appropriate the language and methods of social justice movements to protect their own privilege and avoid consequences for racist behavior. Their successful campaign to ban the phrase N-word guy while ignoring the underlying racism it represents demonstrates how sophisticated manipulation can corrupt even well-intentioned policy-making processes. The complete failure to address the actual racism underlying Randy's television incident reveals how his elaborate victim identity performances prevent genuine confrontation with his own prejudicial attitudes and discriminatory behavior patterns that likely affect his interactions with minority community members in ways that create ongoing harm. His focus on managing social consequences, rather than examining personal beliefs, ensures that fundamental problems remain unaddressed and likely to resurface in future situations. The economic costs associated with Randy's elaborate disability and victim performances include healthcare resources, legal advocacy, transportation accommodation, and policy development expenses that represent significant opportunity costs for community resources that could be directed toward addressing genuine need rather than supporting fraudulent claims. The financial impact of his deceptions extends far beyond immediate family costs to encompass broader social and institutional expenses. The community-level impact of Randy's victim identity appropriation includes the erosion of trust and support for legitimate disability, accommodation, and addiction treatment services, as his fraudulent claims create skepticism and resource scarcity that affect genuinely vulnerable populations depending on these systems for authentic support. His exploitation of social safety nets makes them less available and credible for individuals with genuine needs. The modeling effects that Randy's behavior creates for his family and community members demonstrate how individual manipulation and responsibility avoidance can become normalized and potentially transmitted to others who observe that elaborate victim performances can successfully circumvent accountability and generate sympathy and special treatment. The learning that occurs around his successful deception may influence others' approaches to handling their own mistakes and legal troubles. The long-term psychological consequences for Randy of successfully avoiding accountability through victim identity appropriation include the reinforcement of pathological patterns that prevent genuine growth and development while ensuring that underlying issues remain unaddressed and likely to produce future crises and harmful behaviors. His successful manipulation becomes a psychological trap that prevents authentic healing and relationship development. In the disturbing recognition of how Randy's drunk driving arrest became transformed into elaborate theater of victimhood and disability fraud, we observe the profound ways that individual moral corruption can exploit and undermine social systems designed to provide genuine support for vulnerable populations, demonstrating how privilege and manipulation can be combined to transform legitimate consequences into opportunities for additional advantage, while the fundamental problems that create risk for others remain completely unaddressed and potentially worsened by the successful avoidance of appropriate accountability and behavioral modification. In the disturbing landscape of parental extremism and the weaponization of educational deception, few incidents reveal as much about the intersection of control, violence, and the complete breakdown of family trust as Randy Marsh's elaborate scheme, involving a hired actor posing as Stan's future self to manipulate his son's behavior regarding drug experimentation, This calculated campaign of psychological manipulation, which ultimately escalates to the permanent mutilation of an innocent human being, demonstrates how parental anxiety about adolescent development can become so pathologically extreme that it transforms protective instincts into instruments of trauma and abuse that destroy the very relationships they purport to safeguard. The progression from dishonest conversation to theatrical deception to actual violence reveals the sophisticated psychological mechanisms through which well-intentioned parental concern can metastasize into genuine threats to human safety and dignity. The initial discovery that precipitates Randy's elaborate deception scheme emerges from his observation of Stan's brief contact with marijuana during what should have been a routine disposal of contraband found in their home environment. The fact that Stan's interaction with the substance involves throwing it away rather than consuming it demonstrates his appropriate response to encountering drugs, yet Randy's psychological framework transforms this responsible behavior into evidence of dangerous experimentation, requiring immediate and extreme intervention rather than recognition of his son's good judgment and moral development. The decision to employ professional theatrical deception rather than honest family communication about drug risks and adolescent development reveals parents whose trust in their son's intelligence and moral capacity has been completely overwhelmed by fear-based thinking that views any contact with substances as evidence of inevitable addiction and moral collapse. Their choice of elaborate fraud over straightforward education demonstrates the fundamental breakdown of family communication systems and the parents' inability to engage with their adolescent son as a reasoning individual capable of making informed decisions when provided with accurate information and appropriate support. The hiring of an actor to portray Stan's future self represents a sophisticated level of premeditation and resource investment that transforms what might have been spontaneous, parental overreaction into calculated psychological warfare designed to manipulate a child's behavior through fear and deception rather than education and trust building. The professional nature of their deception demonstrates how parental anxiety can drive otherwise rational adults to engage in elaborate schemes that would be recognized as abusive if perpetrated by non-family members against children. The specific narrative construction of the future Stan character, designed to embody every negative stereotype about drug users and social failure, reveals parents whose understanding of addiction and substance abuse has been completely corrupted by propaganda and fear-mongering, rather than based on scientific evidence or genuine understanding of adolescent development and risk factors. Their caricatured portrayal of drug consequences demonstrates how moral panic can override factual knowledge and create educational approaches that are more likely to produce harm than protection. The psychological impact on Stan of encountering what he believes to be his own future self in a state of degradation and failure creates profound existential anxiety about his identity, potential, and the reliability of his own decision-making processes that extends far beyond immediate concerns about drug use to encompass fundamental questions about personal agency and the predictability of life outcomes. The trauma inflicted through this deception may influence his relationship with risk assessment and self-confidence throughout his adult development. The family dynamics that develop around maintaining the future self-deception require Sharon and Randy to coordinate their lies and sustain elaborate theatrical performances that corrupt their authentic relationships with their son while forcing them to prioritize deception maintenance over genuine family communication and emotional support. The energy invested in sustaining their fraud prevents them from engaging in the honest conversations about adolescent challenges that might actually support Stan's healthy development and decision-making capabilities. The escalation that occurs when Stan announces his intention to cut off his hand to prevent his future self from having hands represents the moment when Randy's deception collides with Stan's logical thinking and creates a crisis that demands immediate resolution through either truth-telling or further escalation of the fraudulent scheme. Stan's proposed solution demonstrates his intelligence and problem-solving abilities, while simultaneously creating impossible demands on his parents' deception that force them toward increasingly extreme measures to maintain their lie. The decision to actually cut off the actor's hand with a meat cleaver represents perhaps the most morally indefensible escalation in Randy's entire behavioral catalog, transforming educational deception into genuine assault and permanent disability, inflicted upon an innocent person whose only involvement was professional performance in what he believed was harmless family theater. The irreversible nature of this violence demonstrates how Randy's commitment to avoiding honest conversation with his son has progressed beyond psychological manipulation into realm of serious criminal behavior. The psychological profile that emerges from Randy's willingness to mutilate another human being rather than admit deception to his son reveals someone whose need for control and authority has become so pathologically extreme that preserving his parental image takes precedence over basic human compassion and legal behavior. His ability to inflict permanent disability on an innocent person demonstrates the complete absence of empathy and proportionality that characterizes genuinely dangerous individuals whose psychological needs override normal moral constraints. The immediate physical consequences for the actor, including shock, blood loss, and the trauma associated with sudden amputation, create genuine medical emergency that transforms Randy's educational scheme into life-threatening crisis, requiring immediate professional intervention that will inevitably expose his deception while creating additional legal and medical complications. The actor's collapse and potential death represent the ultimate expression of how Randy's refusal to engage in honest parenting can escalate into genuine threats to human survival. The legal implications of Randy's assault and mutilation of the hired actor include serious criminal charges related to aggravated assault, mayhem, and potentially attempted murder if the victim dies from his injuries. Yet, the characteristic pattern of Randy's privilege and social position likely shield him from appropriate legal consequences, while the victim bears permanent disability and medical expenses associated with his participation in what he believed was harmless family theater. The psychological trauma inflicted on Stan through witnessing his father commit violent assault with kitchen implements creates complex emotional responses involving fear, confusion, and the complete breakdown of trust in parental protection and moral authority that may influence his relationship with family, authority figures, and conflict resolution throughout his adult life. The modeling effect of Randy's extreme violence teaches dangerous lessons about appropriate responses to frustration and the acceptable limits of parental authority. The community implications of Randy's violent assault include the normalization of extreme parental intervention and the potential influence on other parents who may view his behavior as evidence that elaborate deception and even violence can be justified when addressing adolescent behavioral concerns. The failure to prosecute and publicly condemn his behavior may encourage other parents to engage in similarly extreme measures when dealing with typical adolescent development challenges. The medical and healthcare system impacts of Randy's violence include the emergency medical resources required to address the actor's traumatic amputation, the ongoing medical care and rehabilitation services needed to manage permanent disability, and the potential long-term healthcare costs associated with prosthetic devices and psychological counseling for trauma recovery. These expenses represent significant social costs imposed by Randy's individual choice to use violence rather than communication. The broader social commentary embedded in Randy's escalation to violence reveals how parental anxiety about adolescent drug experimentation can be exploited and amplified by fear-based educational approaches and cultural messaging that transforms normal developmental challenges into crisis situations requiring extreme intervention rather than supportive guidance and accurate information about actual risks and appropriate responses. The failure of social institutions and community oversight to recognize and intervene in Randy's increasingly extreme parental behavior demonstrates systemic inadequacies in protecting both children and vulnerable adults from harm inflicted by individuals whose psychological dysfunction manifests through abuse of parental authority and manipulation of professional service providers who lack adequate protection from violent clients. The economic consequences of Randy's violence include legal costs, medical expenses, potential disability payments, and the lost productivity associated with the actor's permanent injury, all of which represent opportunity costs that could be directed toward genuine drug education and family support services rather than managing the consequences of individual parental dysfunction and criminal behavior. The long-term family relationship consequences of Randy's deception and violence create irreparable damage to trust and communication patterns that may prevent healthy parent-child relationships and force Stan to manage ongoing anxiety about his father's potential for extreme and unpredictable behavior when faced with parenting challenges. The modeling of violence as appropriate conflict resolution may influence Stan's own future relationships and parenting approaches. The comparison between Randy's elaborate deception campaign and evidence-based approaches to adolescent drug education reveals how fear-driven parenting consistently produces worse outcomes than honest communication, accurate information, and supportive family relationships that acknowledge adolescent autonomy while providing appropriate guidance and safety resources. His violent approach represents everything that research suggests parents should avoid when addressing substance use concerns. The psychological analysis of Randy's progression from concerned parent to violent assailant reveals how untreated anxiety and control issues can escalate into genuinely dangerous behavior when combined with narcissistic needs for authority and the absence of appropriate accountability, mechanisms that might interrupt escalating dysfunction before it reaches criminal levels. His behavior demonstrates how individual psychological pathology can exploit parental roles and social trust to inflict serious harm on multiple victims. In the sobering recognition of how Randy's parental concerns about drug experimentation escalated into permanent mutilation of an innocent human being, we observe the ultimate expression of how individual psychological dysfunction can corrupt the most fundamental relationships and social roles, transforming protective instincts into instruments of trauma, while demonstrating that good intentions provide no protection against moral corruption when they operate through pathological, psychological frameworks that prioritize control over communication and violence over trust. In the complex psychology of manufactured crisis and the weaponization of scientific authority for personal aggrandizement, few incidents reveal as much about the intersection of expertise, ego, and catastrophic misjudgment as Randy Marsh's transformation of a minor beaver dam accident into a global warming apocalypse that terrorizes entire populations while diverting critical resources from genuine emergency response. His progression from witness to self-appointed expert to fear-mongering prophet demonstrates how individual psychological needs for significance and recognition can corrupt legitimate environmental concerns and scientific methodology, creating mass hysteria that serves personal gratification while imposing devastating costs on communities facing both real and imaginary threats to their survival and well-being. The initial Beaver Dam incident that serves as the catalyst for Randy's environmental fear campaign represents exactly the kind of minor ecological disruption that occurs regularly in natural systems without requiring extraordinary intervention or apocalyptic interpretation. Yet his immediate psychological response transforms routine environmental dynamics into evidence of civilizational collapse, requiring his urgent expertise and leadership. The flooding of Beaverton that results from Stan and Cartman's accidental dam destruction creates localized emergency conditions that demand practical rescue and relief efforts, rather than grandiose theoretical speculation about global climate patterns. The psychological transformation that occurs when Randy encounters the opportunity to position himself as environmental expert reveals someone whose professional geological background has created just enough scientific credibility to support elaborate theoretical constructions, while lacking the methodological rigor and peer review processes that would normally constrain speculation and ensure accuracy. His geological training provides vocabulary and conceptual frameworks that lend apparent legitimacy to his pronouncements, while his psychological needs drive him toward increasingly dramatic and attention-grabbing interpretations of available evidence. The specific methodology Randy employs in constructing his global warming crisis narrative demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how scientific language and environmental concerns can be manipulated to create compelling media, narratives that bypass critical analysis and rational evaluation in favor of emotional responses and crisis mentality. His ability to connect local flooding to planetary catastrophe through apparently logical causal chains reveals how genuine environmental science can be corrupted when it serves psychological rather than analytical purposes. The immediate embrace of Randy's crisis narrative by media outlets and government officials demonstrates the complex social dynamics that enable individual misinformation campaigns to achieve broad influence when they align with existing cultural anxieties and provide simple explanations for complex problems that resist easy solutions. The willingness of institutional authorities to accept his analysis without verification or peer review reveals systematic vulnerabilities in crisis response systems that can be exploited by individuals with sufficient credentials and confidence to claim expertise. The mass hysteria that emerges from Randy's environmental predictions creates genuine panic and social disruption that extends far beyond the original Beaverton flooding to encompass regional and national emergency responses based on false information and speculative analysis rather than actual environmental monitoring and scientific assessment. The transformation of his individual psychological needs into collective crisis demonstrates how personal dysfunction can metastasize through social and media systems to create widespread harm and resource misallocation. The specific mechanisms through which Randy's misinformation spreads reveal the sophisticated understanding of media dynamics and public psychology that enables his false crisis narrative to overwhelm accurate information and rational analysis, creating information environments where speculation and fear-mongering receive more attention and credibility than careful scientific methodology and evidence-based assessment of actual environmental conditions and risks. The government response that follows Randy's crisis pronouncements demonstrates how individual misinformation can corrupt institutional decision-making processes and force inappropriate allocation of emergency resources based on false premises rather than actual need assessment and rational priority setting. The diversion of rescue and relief capabilities from Beaverton to other locations based on Randy's speculative predictions creates genuine harm for flood victims who require immediate practical assistance rather than theoretical environmental intervention. The abandonment of Beaverton residents on rooftops for 2 days while government resources are redirected to address Randy's phantom global crisis represents perhaps the most morally indefensible consequence of his environmental fear campaign, transforming his personal need for significance into life-threatening emergency for individuals whose actual survival depends on timely rescue and relief efforts that become unavailable due to his false crisis narrative. The psychological profile that emerges from Randy's willingness to allow genuine flood victims to suffer while pursuing recognition as environmental profit reveals someone whose narcissistic needs have completely overwhelmed his capacity for empathy and moral reasoning, creating behavioral patterns where other people's survival becomes secondary to his own psychological gratification and social positioning. His ability to maintain his environmental crisis performance while knowing that real people are dying demonstrates profound moral dysfunction. The scientific methodology failures that characterize Randy's environmental analysis reveal how professional training and credentials can be corrupted when they serve psychological rather than analytical purposes, creating situations where legitimate scientific concepts and terminology are deployed to support conclusions that violate basic principles of evidence, evaluation, and logical reasoning. His geological background provides sufficient credibility to support his claims, while his psychological needs drive him toward dramatic conclusions that exceed what available evidence can reasonably support. The media amplification that transforms Randy's local speculation into national crisis narrative demonstrates how individual misinformation can be magnified through information systems that prioritize novelty and drama over accuracy and verification, creating feedback loops where false information receives more attention and credibility than careful analysis because it generates stronger emotional responses and higher audience engagement. The death toll reporting that escalates Randy's false crisis into claims of massive casualties demonstrates how misinformation campaigns can develop their own momentum and create increasingly extreme claims that bear no relationship to actual conditions or evidence, yet continue to influence institutional responses and public behavior because correction and fact-checking systems prove inadequate to contain false narratives once they achieve sufficient social penetration and official credibility. The resource allocation consequences of Randy's environmental misinformation include the diversion of emergency personnel, equipment, and funding from genuine crisis response to address speculative threats that exist primarily in media narratives rather than physical reality, creating opportunity costs that may result in preventable deaths and suffering among populations facing actual emergencies that receive inadequate attention and support. The long-term environmental policy implications of Randy's false crisis narrative include the potential corruption of legitimate climate science and environmental advocacy through association with his misinformation campaign, creating public skepticism and political resistance to genuine environmental protection efforts that may be dismissed as additional examples of exaggerated crisis mongering rather than recognized as necessary responses to actual environmental threats. The psychological impact on communities terrorized by Randy's apocalyptic environmental predictions includes anxiety, depression, and social disruption that affects individual and family well-being, while creating climate of fear that may persist long after his specific predictions prove false, demonstrating how individual misinformation can create lasting psychological harm that extends far beyond immediate crisis response failures. The institutional credibility damage that results from government and media acceptance of Randy's false environmental crisis includes erosion of public trust in scientific expertise and institutional authority that may compromise future emergency response effectiveness. When genuine threats require coordinated social response based on accurate information and rational analysis rather than speculation and fear-mongering. The community-level social disruption created by Randy's environmental fear campaign includes the breakdown of normal social and economic activities as individuals and families respond to false crisis information through emergency preparedness behaviors and resource hoarding that prove unnecessary, while creating additional stress and conflict within affected communities. The economic costs associated with Randy's false environmental crisis include emergency response expenses, lost productivity from unnecessary evacuation and crisis preparation activities, and the long-term economic impacts of reduced confidence in institutional reliability and environmental information that may affect investment and development decisions in ways that impose ongoing costs on regional economic development. The educational implications of Randy's misinformation campaign include the corruption of environmental science, education, and public understanding of climate issues through association with false crisis narratives that may create lasting skepticism about legitimate environmental concerns and scientific methodology, potentially undermining future environmental protection efforts and climate adaptation planning. The ethical analysis of Randy's behavior reveals someone whose pursuit of personal significance and recognition has completely overridden basic moral obligations to accuracy and truth-telling, creating situations where his psychological gratification takes precedence over community welfare and human survival in ways that demonstrate profound moral corruption and antisocial personality patterns that threaten social cooperation and institutional reliability. The comparison between Randy's speculative environmental crisis and actual climate science demonstrates how legitimate environmental concerns can be corrupted and weaponized when they serve individual psychological needs rather than genuine scientific understanding and environmental protection, creating confusion and skepticism that may undermine necessary collective action to address real environmental threats requiring coordinated social response. In the disturbing recognition of how Randy's need for environmental expertise transformed minor beaver dam flooding into national crisis that abandoned genuine flood victims while terrorizing entire populations with false apocalyptic predictions, we observe the profound ways that individual psychological dysfunction can exploit legitimate, scientific, and environmental concerns to create massive social harm while serving purely personal needs for recognition and significance at the expense of human welfare and institutional credibility. In the catastrophic annals of parental overreach and the weaponization of scientific resources for competitive advantage, few incidents reveal as much about the intersection of cheating, theft, and cosmic-scale consequences as Randy Marsh's systematic corruption of a children's Pinewood Derby competition through the appropriation of Large Hadron Collider technology that ultimately results in humanity's permanent exile from galactic civilization and the nuclear annihilation of an entire nation. His progression from supportive father, seeking competitive edge, to intergalactic criminal mastermind, orchestrating genocide, demonstrates how individual moral corruption can escalate through seemingly logical steps into consequences so vast and irreversible that they transcend personal responsibility to encompass crimes against humanity and violations of cosmic law that doom entire civilizations to isolation and disgrace. The initial motivation that drives Randy toward his Pinewood Derby scheme emerges from his observation of the competitive dynamics surrounding the annual children's race and his determination that his son should not suffer the humiliation of losing to the Hollis family, whose previous victories have apparently created lasting psychological wounds that Randy has internalized as personal failures, requiring extreme corrective measures. His inability to accept that children's competitions might serve developmental rather than competitive purposes reveals someone whose relationship with success and failure has become so pathologically extreme that any perceived defeat becomes existential crisis requiring overwhelming response. The decision to steal a superconducting magnet from the Large Hadron Collider represents a level of criminal sophistication and resource appropriation that transforms what should have been innocent parental support into international theft of scientific equipment worth millions of dollars and critical to advancing human understanding of fundamental physics. His ability to gain access to and remove highly secure scientific apparatus demonstrates both his geological credentials and his complete absence of ethical consideration for the collective human knowledge and scientific progress that his theft will compromise. The psychological framework that allows Randy to rationalize stealing cutting-edge scientific equipment for a children's toy car race reveals someone whose sense of proportion and moral reasoning has been completely overwhelmed by competitive anxiety and narcissistic needs for validation. Through his son's success, his transformation of legitimate scientific research tools into instruments of cheating demonstrates how privilege and access can be corrupted when they serve pathological, psychological needs rather than their intended purposes of advancing human knowledge and capability. The installation of the stolen superconducting magnet into Stan's Pinewood Derby car represents the ultimate expression of Randy's willingness to corrupt childhood activities through adult dysfunction, transforming innocent competition into high-stakes technological warfare that completely undermines the educational and developmental purposes that such activities should serve. His modification of the toy car with advanced physics equipment creates dangerous conditions that threaten not only competitive fairness, but actual physical safety of all participants and spectators. The immediate consequences of Randy's technological intervention exceed all possible predictions as the Pinewood Derby car achieves warp speed and launches into space, creating the first human-made object capable of faster-than-light travel through the inadvertent application of physics principles that were never intended for use in recreational contexts. The achievement of warp capability through a stolen scientific device in a children's toy represents perhaps the most accidental, yet significant technological breakthrough in human history, accomplished through criminal means for trivial purposes. The detection of Stan's warp-capable Pinewood Derby car by galactic authorities represents the moment when Randy's petty cheating scheme transcends terrestrial concerns to attract attention from interstellar civilization, monitoring systems designed to identify species that have achieved faster-than-light capability and might therefore be ready for inclusion in broader galactic community structures. The alien contact that results from his theft demonstrates how individual actions can have consequences that extend far beyond their intended scope to affect entire planetary civilizations. The arrival of baby Fark McGeezax and his demands for reproduction of the warp technology create the first direct alien contact in human history, Yet rather than representing triumph of human achievement and potential for cosmic citizenship, the encounter occurs within the context of Randy's criminal behavior and sets the stage for increasingly deceptive and violent responses that will ultimately doom humanity's chances for galactic acceptance and cooperation. The instruction Randy provides to Stan regarding the murder of baby Fark McGeezax represents perhaps the most morally corrupt moment in his entire behavioral catalogue, as he casually suggests that his 10-year-old son should commit interspecies homicide to resolve the complications created by his own theft and deception. His willingness to involve his child in murder, while framing it as family problem-solving, demonstrates the complete breakdown of protective parental instincts and moral reasoning that should prevent adults from exposing children to violence and criminal liability. The successful assassination of baby Fark McGeezax by Stan, following his father's guidance, creates the first recorded incident of human on alien violence and establishes humanity's initial interstellar reputation as a species capable of duplicity and murder when facing challenges that require diplomatic rather than violent solutions. The psychological trauma inflicted on Stan through forced participation in interspecies homicide represents just one of many devastating consequences flowing from Randy's original decision to cheat in a children's competition. The discovery of space currency among baby Fark McGeezax's possessions creates the catalyst for Randy's next phase of moral corruption, as he immediately recognizes the potential for enormous financial gain through appropriation of alien monetary resources, rather than considering appropriate protocols for handling evidence of extraterrestrial contact or honoring the property rights of deceased alien visitors. His instant transformation from murderer to thief demonstrates the progressive nature of moral corruption once initial ethical boundaries have been crossed. The successful conversion of Randy's individual greed into collective human conspiracy through his influence over world leaders demonstrates his remarkable ability to corrupt institutional authority and international cooperation through appeals to economic self-interest that override moral reasoning and legal obligations. His persuasion of global leadership to participate in theft of alien currency represents perhaps his greatest achievement in spreading individual moral corruption into systemic institutional failure. The decision to conceal the theft of space currency from galactic authorities rather than reporting the alien contact and death according to appropriate protocols represents the moment when humanity collectively chooses criminal conspiracy over honest cooperation with interstellar civilization, setting the stage for the catastrophic consequences that will follow when their deception is inevitably discovered by galactic monitoring and enforcement systems. The identification of Finland as the primary obstacle to maintaining the conspiracy about stolen space currency creates the conditions for Randy's most extreme escalation, as he recognizes that successful concealment of their crime requires elimination of any human institutions or populations that threaten to reveal the truth about their theft and deception to galactic authorities who will inevitably investigate the death of their missing agent. The nuclear annihilation of Finland that Randy orchestrates through his influence over international leadership represents the ultimate expression of how individual moral corruption can scale up to encompass genocide when maintaining personal advantage requires elimination of moral opposition and truth-telling institutions. The death of 5.3 million innocent Finnish citizens to protect a theft conspiracy demonstrates how individual greed can escalate into crimes against humanity when supported by institutional corruption and collective moral failure. The environmental and global consequences of nuclear weapons deployment against Finland include radioactive contamination that will affect neighboring regions for generations, atmospheric pollution that will influence global climate patterns, and geopolitical disruption that will reshape international relations and security structures in ways that serve Randi's conspiracy, while imposing massive costs on global civilization and environmental stability. The galactic test framework that is revealed following the nuclear destruction of Finland demonstrates that humanity's initial contact with interstellar civilization was actually a carefully designed evaluation of human moral development and readiness for inclusion in broader galactic community structures. The testing protocol reveals sophisticated understanding of species development patterns and appropriate mechanisms for evaluating civilizational maturity and ethical advancement. The failure of humanity's galactic citizenship test, due to their theft of space currency and concealment of alien death, represents the ultimate consequence of Randi's original decision to cheat in a children's competition, as his individual moral corruption has metastasized through human civilization to permanently disqualify the entire species from participation in galactic community and cosmic citizenship opportunities that might have transformed human development and potential. The permanent isolation of Earth within a massive cubical force field represents the galactic community's response to humanity's demonstrated unfitness for interstellar cooperation and cosmic citizenship, creating a prison planet scenario where human civilization will develop in complete isolation from the broader universe due to their failure to meet basic moral standards for inclusion in advanced civilizational structures. The psychological profile that emerges from Randi's progression from Pinewood Derby, cheating to orchestrating global nuclear genocide, reveals someone whose individual moral corruption has achieved such extraordinary scope and influence that his personal psychological pathology has become embedded in human civilization's permanent cosmic status and future developmental potential. His transformation from suburban father to architect of humanity's galactic exile represents perhaps the most complete expression of how individual dysfunction can achieve civilizational consequences. The economic implications of humanity's permanent galactic isolation include the loss of access to advanced alien technologies, interstellar trade opportunities, and cosmic resources that might have accelerated human development and solved environmental and resource limitations that will now constrain terrestrial civilization indefinitely. The opportunity costs associated with Randi's moral failures extend across multiple generations and encompass the entire future trajectory of human potential and achievement. The long-term consequences for human civilization of permanent galactic exile include technological stagnation, cultural isolation, and the psychological burden of knowing that cosmic citizenship and interstellar community remain forever inaccessible due to moral failures that could have been avoided through basic ethical behavior and honest cooperation with alien contact protocols. In the cosmic recognition of how Randi's desire to win a children's toy car race escalated through theft, murder, conspiracy, and genocide to permanently exile humanity from galactic civilization, while dooming millions of innocent people to nuclear annihilation, we observe the ultimate expression of how individual moral corruption can achieve consequences so vast and irreversible that they transcend personal responsibility to encompass crimes against entire species and violations of cosmic law that transform private psychological dysfunction into permanent, civilizational tragedy affecting the entire future of human development and potential. In the profound transformation of individual identity and the complete subordination of family welfare to personal obsession, few episodes reveal as much about the intersection of midlife crisis, entrepreneurial delusion, and the systematic destruction of community bonds, as Randy Marsh's metamorphosis from respected geologist into cannabis entrepreneur, whose marijuana fixation ultimately consumes not only his own identity, but the entire narrative structure of South Park itself. His progression from occasional recreational user to full-time farmer to cultural appropriator of integrity concepts, while demonstrating none, represents the ultimate expression of how individual psychological needs can override all other considerations, including family stability, community responsibility, and basic moral coherence, creating a feedback loop where personal obsession becomes so consuming that reality itself must be reshaped to accommodate and validate his choices. The initial career transition that transforms Randy from geological consultant to marijuana entrepreneur represents far more than simple occupational change. It constitutes a fundamental reorganization of his identity around a substance and lifestyle that had previously occupied only recreational space in his psychological architecture. His abandonment of scientific methodology and professional expertise in favor of agricultural pursuits, driven primarily by enthusiasm rather than knowledge, demonstrates how midlife psychological crises can lead individuals to reject established competencies and social positions in favor of pursuits that promise excitement and relevance at the cost of stability and rational planning. The geographical relocation that forces the entire Marsh family to abandon their established South Park community connections and social networks in service of Randy's agricultural ambitions represents perhaps the most comprehensive expression of his narcissistic disregard for others' needs and preferences when they conflict with his psychological requirements for significance and identity transformation. The transition from suburban neighborhood to isolated rural farm creates social isolation and lifestyle disruption that affects every family member, while serving primarily to accommodate Randy's need for physical and symbolic separation from his previous identity and responsibilities. The appropriation of integrity concepts as branding and identity framework for his marijuana business reveals someone whose relationship with moral principles has become entirely instrumental and performative, rather than based on genuine, ethical development and consistent behavioral standards. His adoption of integrity language, while demonstrating systematic dishonesty, manipulation, and disregard for others' welfare, demonstrates how certain personality types can weaponize moral concepts to enhance their social positioning and business success, while remaining fundamentally unchanged in their actual behavior, patterns, and ethical reasoning. The psychological mechanisms underlying Randy's cannabis obsession reveals someone whose relationship with the substance has progressed far beyond recreational use or legitimate medical application into the realm of identity fusion, where his sense of self becomes completely dependent on marijuana cultivation, promotion, and consumption activities. His inability to maintain interest in other activities or relationships that do not directly serve his cannabis enterprise demonstrates the kind of narrowing and rigidity that characterizes advanced addiction and compulsive behavior patterns. The impact on Stan's adolescent development of being forced to relocate and adapt his entire social and educational environment to accommodate his father's midlife career change creates developmental disruption and family resentment that reflects the broader pattern of Randy's psychological needs taking precedence over age-appropriate family stability and support systems. Stan's increasing alienation from his father's obsessions demonstrates the natural response of healthy family members to pathological behavior patterns that demand accommodation rather than offering genuine relationship and mutual support. The business model that emerges from Randy's cannabis entrepreneurship reveals someone whose understanding of agricultural, legal, and market dynamics remains fundamentally amateur, despite his professional confidence and public presentations of expertise. His repeated cycles of dramatic success, followed by catastrophic failure, demonstrate the kind of boom-bust patterns that characterize ventures driven by psychological needs rather than realistic assessment of capabilities, market conditions, and sustainable business practices. The community impact of Randy's transformation, from respected professional to marijuana entrepreneur, includes the loss of geological expertise and scientific leadership that had previously contributed to South Park's problem-solving capabilities during environmental and infrastructure crises. His abandonment of scientific methodology and community service in favor of personal business interests creates service gaps that affect community resilience and problem-solving capacity when technical expertise becomes necessary for addressing collective challenges. The regulatory and legal complications that consistently emerge from Randy's cannabis operations reveal someone whose relationship with authority and compliance has become characterized by creative interpretation and boundary testing rather than straightforward adherence to established laws and regulations designed to ensure public safety and fair market competition. His pattern of pushing legal limits while claiming good intentions demonstrates how individual entrepreneurial ambition can create ongoing conflict with social institutions and community standards. The family economic consequences of Randy's career transition include the instability and uncertainty associated with agricultural ventures dependent on regulatory environments, market fluctuations, and seasonal factors that create financial stress and planning difficulties for family members who had previously enjoyed the security of steady professional income and predictable economic circumstances. The transformation from stable middle-class lifestyle to entrepreneurial uncertainty affects educational planning, retirement security, and emergency preparedness in ways that impose costs on other family members. The cultural appropriation elements that characterize Randy's integrity branding reveal someone whose marketing and identity construction draws extensively on concepts and imagery associated with traditional agricultural communities and values while lacking authentic connection to or understanding of the historical and social contexts that give these symbols their original meaning. His superficial adoption of farmer identity and rural lifestyle aesthetics demonstrates how certain individuals can commodify and exploit cultural symbols without engaging with their deeper significance or responsibilities. The escalation pattern visible in Randy's cannabis enterprise demonstrates how initial business success and social validation can feed psychological needs in ways that drive increasingly extreme and risky behavior designed to maintain the same level of attention and significance when novelty wears off and competition increases. His progression from simple cultivation to elaborate schemes and cultural commentary reveals someone whose satisfaction depends on constantly increasing levels of stimulation and recognition that create unsustainable business and personal dynamics. The relationship between Randy's marijuana focus and his family's social isolation reveals how individual obsessions can systematically erode the social connections and community integration that provide stability and support for healthy family development. The rural location and specialized focus of his business activities create barriers to normal community participation and social relationship maintenance that affect all family members, while serving primarily his psychological and business needs. The impact on Sharon's identity and social position of being transformed from geologist's wife to marijuana farmer's spouse creates role, confusion, and social displacement that reflects the broader pattern of Randy's choices, forcing others to adapt their identities and social relationships to accommodate his psychological and business requirements. Her accommodation of his career change, while managing resulting social and economic uncertainty, demonstrates how individual midlife crises can impose adaptation demands on entire family systems. The educational implications for Stan of his father's public identification with marijuana culture include potential social stigma and identity complications that may affect his peer relationships, academic opportunities, and future career prospects in ways that reflect Randy's choices rather than his own interests and capabilities. The modeling effects of his father's cannabis obsession may influence his own relationship with substances and authority in ways that create additional developmental challenges. The media and cultural commentary that Randy's cannabis enterprise generates reflects his ability to leverage agricultural activity into broader social and political positioning that serves his needs for recognition and influence, while potentially creating controversy and conflict that affects his family's privacy and community relationships. His transformation of business activities into cultural performance demonstrates how certain personalities require constant attention and validation that extends far beyond normal commercial success. The environmental impact of Randy's agricultural operations includes resource consumption, chemical usage, and land management practices that may affect local ecological systems and community environmental quality in ways that serve his business interests, while potentially creating costs for broader community environmental health and sustainability. His transition from geological expertise to agricultural activity represents lost environmental knowledge and stewardship capacity. The long-term sustainability questions surrounding Randy's cannabis enterprise include market saturation, regulatory changes, and the physical and psychological demands of maintaining agricultural operations that require consistent attention and expertise that may exceed his actual capabilities and commitment levels. The boom-bust cycles that characterize his business activities suggest underlying structural problems that threaten long-term viability and family economic security. The philosophical contradictions embedded in Randy's integrity branding, while demonstrating systematic dishonesty and manipulation, reveal someone whose relationship with moral concepts has become entirely superficial and strategic, rather than based on genuine ethical development and consistent behavioral standards. His ability to market integrity while behaving unethically demonstrates the kind of cognitive compartmentalization that prevents authentic personal growth and relationship development. The community leadership vacuum created by Randy's abandonment of his geological expertise and civic engagement in favor of cannabis entrepreneurship represents lost social capital and technical capacity that affects South Park's ability to address environmental challenges and infrastructure needs that require scientific knowledge and professional problem-solving capabilities that he previously provided. The psychological analysis of Randy's complete identity transformation reveals someone whose midlife development has become arrested at the stage of adolescent identity exploration rather than progressing toward mature adult integration of experience, responsibility, and service to others. His cannabis obsession represents regression to earlier developmental stages rather than growth toward greater wisdom and social contribution. In the melancholy recognition of how Randy's marijuana enterprise ultimately consumed not only his own identity and family stability, but the entire community narrative that had previously provided context and meaning for collective life in South Park, we observe the ultimate expression of how individual midlife crisis and substance obsession can metastasize into total lifestyle transformation that sacrifices everything meaningful in service of maintaining psychological excitement and social positioning around activities that provide temporary satisfaction while destroying the authentic relationships and community bonds that constitute the actual foundation of meaningful human existence and genuine integrity. In the catastrophic convergence of environmental destruction, technological exploitation, and the complete monetization of natural disasters, few episodes reveal as much about the intersection of corporate ambition, ecological vandalism, and the systematic transformation of community crisis into personal profit opportunity, as Randy Marsh's expansion from marijuana entrepreneur into streaming media mogul, whose digital entertainment empire literally threatens the physical existence of South Park through water resource manipulation and drought engineering. His progression from cannabis farmer to content creator to environmental terrorist demonstrates how individual entrepreneurial ambition can escalate into genuine threats to community survival. When personal profit motives override all consideration for ecological sustainability, social responsibility, and the basic human right to clean water and environmental security. The initial transition that transforms Randy from agricultural entrepreneur to digital media mogul represents his characteristic pattern of abandoning established competencies in favor of trendy business opportunities that promise greater recognition and financial reward without requiring genuine expertise or long-term commitment to sustainable practices. His embrace of streaming technology and content creation demonstrates how certain personality types consistently gravitate toward whatever industries appear to offer maximum attention and validation while remaining fundamentally uncommitted to mastering the actual skills and knowledge necessary for genuine success and positive contribution. The streaming service infrastructure that Randy develops to support his media ambitions creates unprecedented demands on local water resources and electrical systems that were never designed to accommodate the massive cooling and processing requirements associated with digital content distribution and server farm operations. His transformation of South Park's modest technological infrastructure into industrial-scale computing operation represents the kind of resource appropriation that treats community assets as personal business resources without consideration for environmental impact or community consent and participation in development decisions. The psychological profile that drives Randy's streaming media obsession reveals someone whose need for audience, attention, and cultural influence has progressed beyond normal entrepreneurial ambition into the realm of megalomaniacal fantasy, where his personal content and commentary become essential cultural services deserving of unlimited resource allocation and community sacrifice. His inability to distinguish between legitimate business development and parasitic resource extraction demonstrates how narcissistic personality patterns can corrupt entrepreneurial activity into forms of community exploitation and environmental destruction. The water shortage crisis that emerges from Randy's streaming operations represents the moment when his individual business ambitions collide with basic community survival needs, creating conditions where his personal profit directly threatens the health and welfare of every South Park resident who depends on shared water resources for drinking, sanitation, agricultural needs, and basic human dignity. The transformation of essential public resources into private business inputs demonstrates how certain business models constitute direct attacks on community welfare and environmental sustainability. The drought conditions that Randy's water consumption creates throughout the broader Colorado region extend his individual resource appropriation into regional environmental crisis that affects agricultural communities, wildlife habitats, and ecosystem stability across geographic areas that have no connection to his business activities, yet bear the environmental costs of his resource-intensive operations. The scaling of individual consumption into regional ecological disaster demonstrates how modern business practices can create environmental impacts that far exceed local capacity to manage or mitigate harmful consequences. The corporate persona that Randy adopts to justify and promote his streaming operations reveals sophisticated understanding of how business language and entrepreneurial rhetoric can be deployed to rationalize behavior that would be recognized as harmful and antisocial if described in plain terms rather than corporate euphemisms. His transformation of water theft and environmental destruction into innovation and economic development demonstrates how language can be weaponized to obscure moral reality and prevent appropriate community response to harmful business practices. The Karen identity that Randy assumes as part of his streaming content strategy represents perhaps his most disturbing cultural appropriation, as he systematically adopts the behavioral patterns and social positioning associated with entitled consumer activism, while completely reversing its intended purposes to serve corporate rather than consumer interests. His transformation of legitimate customer advocacy tactics into corporate manipulation tools demonstrates how individual psychological pathology can corrupt and weaponize even positive social movements when they serve narcissistic rather than collective needs. The specific methodology Randy employs in his Karen performance reveals sophisticated understanding of how grievance, culture, and victim positioning can be manipulated to generate audience engagement and social media attention while serving corporate interests that directly contradict the consumer protection purposes that legitimate Karen behavior is intended to serve. His ability to appropriate victim identity while actually perpetrating harm demonstrates the kind of psychological reversal that characterizes advanced manipulation and antisocial personality patterns. The environmental destruction that Randy's streaming operations inflict on South Park's natural landscape includes not only water depletion but soil contamination, air quality degradation, and ecosystem disruption that will affect plant and animal communities for generations, while serving purely temporary business interests that provide no lasting benefit to community development or environmental stewardship. The transformation of South Park's natural environment into industrial wasteland demonstrates how individual business ambitions can systematically destroy the ecological foundations that support community life and long-term sustainability. The community displacement that results from Randy's environmental destruction forces long-time residents to abandon homes, businesses, and social connections that represent decades of community building and relationship development, creating refugee conditions within their own hometown as his resource extraction makes normal life impossible for anyone who lacks access to alternative water sources and environmental protection. The transformation of neighbors into environmental refugees demonstrates how individual business practices can destroy the social fabric and community bonds that provide meaning and stability for collective life. The technological infrastructure that Randy constructs to support his streaming empire creates permanent environmental damage through concrete installation, electrical system modification, and industrial equipment placement that will persist long after his business interests have moved on to other opportunities, leaving South Park with environmental contamination and resource depletion that the community will bear indefinitely, while receiving no lasting benefit from the temporary business activity that created these problems. The regulatory circumvention strategies that Randy employs to avoid environmental oversight and community input regarding his streaming operations reveal sophisticated understanding of how bureaucratic systems and legal frameworks can be manipulated to permit harmful activities while preventing appropriate community participation in decisions that affect their environmental health and resource security. His ability to exploit regulatory gaps demonstrates how individual actors with sufficient resources and legal knowledge can circumvent democratic processes designed to protect community interests. The economic inequality that Randy's streaming success creates within South Park includes his accumulation of significant wealth through resource extraction, while community members bear increasing costs for water access, environmental remediation, and health impacts associated with his operations. The privatization of profits while socializing environmental costs represents the classic pattern of extractive business practices that enrich individual entrepreneurs while impoverishing the communities that provide the resources and absorb the negative consequences. The psychological impact on community members of watching their environment systematically destroyed for one individual's business profit includes anxiety, depression, and learned helplessness, as they recognize their inability to prevent or mitigate environmental damage through normal democratic processes and community organizing efforts. The trauma associated with environmental destruction represents a form of collective psychological injury that affects community mental health and social cohesion in ways that persist long after immediate business activities have ceased. The water rationing and conservation measures that become necessary due to Randy's streaming operations impose lifestyle restrictions and economic costs on community members who must modify their daily activities and household practices to accommodate the resource scarcity created by his business consumption. The transformation of abundant natural resources into scarce commodities through individual business activity demonstrates how private enterprise can systematically undermine community welfare and quality of life. The wildlife and ecosystem impacts of Randy's water appropriation include habitat destruction, species displacement, and ecological system collapse that affects plant and animal communities throughout the region, while providing no environmental benefit to offset the massive ecological costs imposed by his streaming infrastructure and operations. The sacrifice of biodiversity and ecological health for digital entertainment represents perhaps the most morally indefensible aspect of his entire business model. The long-term environmental legacy that Randy's streaming operations create for South Park includes water table depletion, soil degradation, and infrastructure damage that will require decades of remediation efforts and significant public investment to address, while providing no lasting economic or social benefit to justify the enormous environmental costs imposed on current and future community members. The intergenerational impact of his business decisions demonstrates how individual short-term profit can impose permanent costs on future generations who had no voice in the decisions that created these environmental burdens. The climate change implications of Randy's streaming operations include increased carbon emissions from server cooling, water processing, and electrical consumption that contribute to global environmental problems, while serving purely local business interests that provide no offsetting environmental benefits or climate mitigation activities. His transformation of local resources into global environmental costs demonstrates how individual business practices can impose planetary-scale consequences that far exceed any local economic benefits generated by the commercial activity. The community organizing responses that emerge in reaction to Randy's environmental destruction reveal both the resilience and limitations of grassroots political action when confronting well-resourced individual actors who have sufficient legal and financial advantages to resist community pressure and continue harmful activities, despite widespread opposition and clear evidence of environmental and social damage. The political and regulatory implications of Randy's streaming empire include the exposure of inadequate environmental protection systems and democratic decision-making processes that prove unable to prevent individual actors from imposing massive community costs when they possess sufficient resources and legal sophistication to exploit system weaknesses and circumvent appropriate oversight and accountability mechanisms. In the devastating recognition of how Randy's streaming media ambitions transformed South Park's abundant natural resources into industrial wasteland, while forcing community members to become environmental refugees in their own hometown, we observe the ultimate expression of how individual corporate ambition can systematically destroy the ecological and social foundations that support community life, demonstrating that entrepreneurial success achieved through environmental destruction and community resource appropriation represents not economic development, but a form of slow-motion community murder that sacrifices everything meaningful about place and belonging in service of temporary business profits that enrich individuals while impoverishing the collective heritage and environmental security that should be preserved for future generations. As our exploration of Randy's catastrophic choices draws to a close, we find ourselves contemplating the profound tragedy of a man who possesses every advantage, yet consistently chooses destruction over construction, chaos over peace. Randy Marsh represents the dark mirror of American possibility, the college-educated professional, the suburban father, the community member who should be a force for stability and growth, yet whose unchecked ego and desperate need for significance create ripples of harm that extend far beyond his comprehension. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of privilege without wisdom, enthusiasm without consideration, and ambition without empathy. In Randy's endless quest to matter, to be special, to transcend the mundane responsibilities of adulthood, he consistently sacrifices the very relationships and community bonds that give life actual meaning. Perhaps there is something beautiful in the consistency of his chaos, the reliability of his unreliability, the way his failures illuminate the path toward better choices. Sleep now, knowing that in the snowy streets of South Park, the consequences of Randy's next terrible decision are already taking root, and somehow the world continues to turn despite his best efforts to stop it. Rest peacefully.